Deep Purple was never just a band. It was an icon forged from sound, conflict, and personalities that refused to stand still. Within that structure, Ritchie Blackmore was not merely a guitarist. He was the axis, the source of the riff, of the atmosphere, of the confrontational spirit that became inseparable from Deep Purple's identity for decades. So when Blackmore left the band in the middle of a tour in 1993, Deep Purple did not simply lose a member. They lost a living piece of their own history. And in that very moment, a dangerous question emerged. A question no rock band ever wants to face. Can a legend continue to exist when the one who created its shadow has stepped away? In 1994, Deep Purple needed a new guitarist. Not to change their identity, not to start over, but to continue existing, to right beneath the crushing weight of the history they themselves had created. That position demanded more than skill. It required the ability to stand firm against comparison, against the collective memory of millions of listeners, and against a name that had become a benchmark. And then, the name chosen resembled nothing anyone had expected. Not a familiar rock god, not a guitarist raised in the British blues rock tradition, not someone carrying a dark, provocative demeanor, or eager to step into a new battle of egos. It was Steve Morse, an American musician, emerging from the world of fusion, where technique, structure, and academic thinking are placed above image. A man almost entirely opposite to the guitarist archetype that Deep Purple had etched into the public imagination. For many fans, that choice did not merely provoke doubt. It seemed almost like an obvious mistake. How could an outsider step into a position once held by Blackmore without being crushed by comparison? How could a guitarist lacking the classic Purple essence stand on the stage of a band that lived off the very shadow of its past? From that very first moment, Steve Morse was not only confronting music, he was confronting a colossal shadow, a shadow that rock history had already proven. No one survives by trying to step inside it. And this story begins from what seemed like an unwinnable position, a place where merely existing was already a challenge. Before the name Steve Morse appeared in the world of Deep Purple, he had long existed in a very different space, a space where hard rock was not the center, a world in which technique, structure, and musical thinking were placed above image and stage mythology. In the late 1970s, Morse co-founded Dixie Dregs, a band that could hardly be neatly classified into any single genre. Their music was a convergence of fusion, Southern American country, jazz, classical, and progressive rock. There were no riffs to shout along to, no choruses for audiences to sing in unison, only complex structures, intricate transitions, and a level of musical discipline rarely seen in rock at the time. Steve Morse stood out in that world not because of showmanship. He stood out because of precision, because of an almost absolute control over his instrument. Fingerstyle, hybrid picking, long note sequences arranged like equations. All of it stemmed from the mindset of a musician, not that of a rock star seeking to dominate the stage. More importantly, Morse did not emerge from the blues-based tradition that formed the foundation of British hard rock. He did not build music from simple riffs, dark melodies, or instinctive repetition. What concerned him was the overall structure, the way musical sections connected to one another, the idea that every note existed to serve a larger picture. In that context, Steve Morse was a multi-dimensional artist. But for that very reason, he did not belong to the classic hard rock guitarist archetype. He carried no darkness, no confrontational spirit, no ego ready for collision. Instead, there was calmness, discipline, and an attitude almost neutral toward fame. And it was precisely that difference which, in the eyes of many, became a problem. Because if Deep Purple was an empire built on conflict and strong personalities, then Steve Morse came from a world where music was organized like architecture, a world with no room for public ego battles. He was a virtuoso, but a virtuoso standing outside the hard rock system. And that made the question clearer than ever. Could someone like that survive in a band that lived on history, mythology, and the colossal shadows of its past? By the end of 1993, Deep Purple was not in the state of a stable legend. They were in the middle of an intense tour for the album The Battle Rages On, a title that sounded almost prophetic for the band's own internal situation. The relationship between Ritchie Blackmore and the rest of the group had been fractured for a long time. Performances were tense. Decisions were made in a cold atmosphere. And then Blackmore left in the middle of the tour, with reconciliation nearly impossible. At that moment, Deep Purple did not simply lose a guitarist. They faced the risk of collapse. Canceling the tour would have meant massive financial losses, damaged credibility, and potentially the end of a name that had existed for decades. The band needed someone who could step in immediately, not to create something new, but to keep everything from falling into the abyss. Steve Morse was contacted under those circumstances. There was no time for extended preparation, no safe trial period. He accepted and almost immediately entered a race against time. In just a few short weeks, Morse had to learn dozens of songs that were deeply embedded in the collective memory of fans, from aggressive hard rock numbers to solos that had become iconic. But learning the notes was the easiest part. The harder challenge was understanding how Deep Purple breathed on stage, how Ian Gillan phrased lines in a live setting, how Ian Pace pushed the tempo during climactic moments, how Roger Glover anchored the structure. Deep Purple was not a band that played exactly like the studio recordings. They stretched, they improvised, they challenged one another. Steve Morse was not merely stepping into the role of a guitarist. He was stepping into an ecosystem that had been operating for many years. And then the first night arrived. The audience did not come merely to listen to music. They came to verify, to compare, to see whether the man on stage dared to touch the solos of Highway Star or Child in Time without his hands trembling. Every time Morse stepped forward to solo, the atmosphere nearly froze. Not because he played incorrectly, but because everyone was waiting to see whom he would sound like. Steve Morse understood that very clearly. He could not become Blackmore. He did not possess phrasing rooted in British blues. He did not have the habit of bending notes in a dark, provocative way. But if he changed too much, would Deep Purple still retain the soul that audiences had loved for decades? That was the dilemma. If he tried to imitate, he would forever remain a copy. If he played in his own way, he risked rejection. That pressure did not come from within the band. They needed him. It came from the collective memory of the fans, a memory that was unforgiving, a standard carved deeply by time. And so each of Steve Morse's early nights with Deep Purple was not merely a performance. It was a musical trial without a spoken verdict, a direct confrontation with the shadow of the past. He could not be Blackmore, but if he was not Blackmore, would audiences accept a Deep Purple entering a new chapter? That storm did not exist only on the stage. It lay within the very definition of the band itself. And Steve Morse, whether he wanted to or not, had stepped straight into its center. After the first nights filled with doubt, Steve Morse stood before a defining choice. He could try to become a safe version of the past, playing as close as possible, keeping everything familiar so that no one would feel uncomfortable. Or he could accept the risk, preserve the soul of Deep Purple without losing himself. Morse chose the second path. He did not attempt to copy Blackmore's phrasing. He did not bend notes in the classic blues-based way. He did not recreate the darkness and tension that had defined the 1970s. On stage, he also did not simulate a cold, confrontational posture toward the audience. No guitars smashed, no theatrically charged moments of confrontation. Instead, there was a calmness almost like that of an engineer, an approach focused on structure, on precision, on making the band operate more smoothly, rather than becoming the center of conflict. This became clear when Deep Purple released Perpendicular in 1996, their first studio album with Steve Morse. This was not an attempt to recreate the past. The sound was brighter. The guitar layers were thicker yet more streamlined. The transitions were more complex, relying less on repetitive, minimalist riffs. Purple no longer carried the heavy tension of earlier years. They sounded more open. For Morse, the guitar was no longer a battlefield where egos collided head-on. It became part of the overall architecture. His solos were not meant to overpower. They were constructed as part of a flow, with a clear beginning, development, and resolution. Rather than provoking conflict, they created cohesion. Subsequent albums like Abandon and Bananas continued to reinforce this direction. Deep Purple of the 1990s and 2000s no longer tried to prove that they were still the most dangerous band on stage. They focused on stability, on maintaining performance quality, on writing music with a more mature spirit. Here, Steve Morse's role was gradually redefined. He did not replace Blackmore in the traditional sense. He did not try to fill the void by standing exactly in the old position. Instead, he changed the very way that position existed. The guitar in Deep Purple was no longer the center of creative battles. It became a pillar, a stabilizing element, a solid structure that allowed the rest of the band to evolve without fear of collapse. That may not have produced shocking moments like in the past, but it produced something else, a long-term foundation. Steve Morse understood that he could not compete with a legend by trying to defeat it. The only way to survive was not to enter that competition in the first place. And through that choice, he not only preserved his own identity, he quietly restructured the role of the guitarist in Deep Purple for a different era. If there was one thing that stood out most in the Steve Morse era, it was not a controversial album, not an aesthetic overthrow, and certainly not dramatic, explosive moments. What defined this period, on the contrary, was the absence of all those things. No scandals, no public conflicts, no walking off mid-tour, no creative wars dragging on to exhaustion. In the world of rock, where legends are often built from collision and collapse, stability is almost abnormal. Yet it was precisely that abnormality that became the foundation for Deep Purple over the next nearly 3 decades. From 1994 to 2022, the band maintained a lineup rare in its durability. Ian Gillan, Roger Glover, Ian Pace, and Steve Morse. Not because they always agreed absolutely, but because they understood one another's boundaries. They understood each person's role within a structure already fragile after decades of upheaval. Deep Purple in this period was no longer a creative battlefield. No more quiet power struggles. No more tension hanging in the air, ready to explode. Instead, there was a steady rhythm of operation. Albums released on a reasonable cycle, tours carefully planned, and each member focused on doing his part well. Steve Morse played a central role in that shift, not by exerting control, but by not occupying space unnecessarily. He did not push the guitar to the front lines to dominate. He did not turn each album into a platform to assert personal ego. His presence was stabilizing, like a load-bearing structure, rarely noticed, yet indispensable. Touring became the core activity. Deep Purple no longer needed to prove who they were. They appeared consistently, played solidly, and left the stage without crisis trailing behind. Compared to the 1970s, filled with internal wars and fractures, this was a more mature, calmer, and more pragmatic Deep Purple. Perhaps, in terms of pure creativity, this was not their most revolutionary phase. No album redefined rock history. No moment shifted the course of an era. But in return, it was the most sustainable period the band had ever experienced. And within that context, Steve Morse did not emerge as a hero. He emerged as a necessary condition. Proof that sometimes, in rock, the greatest value does not lie in creating more conflict, but in keeping everything from falling apart. That stability may not have been loud, but it was what allowed Deep Purple to continue existing, while many other legends dissolved under the very storms they once glorified. The initial skepticism toward Steve Morse did not disappear overnight. It could not fade that quickly, because Deep Purple is a band whose fans' memory always runs ahead of the present. But over the years, a quiet shift took place. Not because Morse proved himself to be better, but because he proved something more difficult. That he could be there, persistently, without making everything fall apart. Fans gradually began to see him through a different lens. Steve Morse did not create smoke on the water. He was not part of the era in which the legend was born. He did not own riffs that had become signatures of popular culture. And so, there would always be an invisible distance between him and the sacred aura of the Blackmore years. Yet over time, people began to understand that Deep Purple did not exist solely to retell the past. They existed because they could still step onto the stage, and do so with dignity. Morse's role was not one of disruption. He did not come to redefine Deep Purple. He came to preserve the structure, to keep the band functioning like a mature body, no longer self-destructing just to produce a few explosive moments. At a deeper level, this is a lesson that runs counter to how rock often tells its own story. Rock glorifies drama. It glorifies arguments, walkouts, downfalls driven by ego, by substances, by self-immolation in the name of becoming a legend. People remember explosions more easily than ordinary days. They praise chaos more readily than discipline. They are quicker to call an artist great when everything burns brightly, even if only for a moment. Steve Morse does not belong to that kind of legend. He does not stun audiences with danger. He reassures them with consistency. He is the kind of guitarist who does not pull a band into another ego-driven war, but allows it to continue existing as a serious musical entity. And then, a different kind of respect emerges. Not loud, not feverish like the worship of legends, but a mature acknowledgement that some people are not born to become moments. They are born to become foundations. Steve Morse, in that sense, becomes proof that stability can also be an artistic value, not merely a moral quality, not merely a professional attitude, but a creative choice. The choice not to turn music into a battlefield, so that music can continue to exist. And in a band that once lived on conflict, that may be the deepest change Steve Morse ever left behind. In 2022, Steve Morse left Deep Purple. There were no warning signs of a crisis, no lengthy statements, no declarations of rupture or blame. The departure unfolded in a way very much like the man himself throughout nearly 3 decades with the band. Quiet, clear, and without aftershocks. Not because of conflict, not because of creative disagreement, not because of a sense of being pushed out of history. The reason was simpler and harder. Steve Morse left to care for his wife, who was seriously ill. A personal choice, not a strategic one, not a career move, not an attempt to protect an image, not an effort to reposition himself in public memory. In the world of rock, where farewells are often framed as tragedy or betrayal, that decision carried almost no drama. Yet it was precisely the absence of drama that said so much. Steve Morse did not leave Deep Purple to assert his ego. He left because he understood that there are roles more important than the stage. The final image of him in the band was not a slammed door, not a statement meant to be remembered. It was a man stepping away from the lights to return to a private responsibility, a place with no audience, no applause, and no legacy to defend. He did not break anything. He did not disrupt schedules. He did not leave behind a void filled with resentment. Steve Morse left the way he had arrived, without occupying space, without demanding anything. In a career defined by quiet choices, this was perhaps the most consistent one. A decision that showed that after all the legends, the tours, and the historical shadows, he still placed human life above the stage. And in doing so, Steve Morse once again reminded us that not every important moment in rock happens under the lights. Some moments exist only in silence, and it is those moments that reveal the true nature of a person. So how can a guitarist step into a position once held by Ritchie Blackmore and still preserve his own identity? The answer does not lie in technique, not in finger speed, nor in who plays the better solo. The answer lies in choice. Steve Morse did not enter Deep Purple with the ambition of defeating the past. He did not treat it as a competition with a legend. He did not try to rewrite history or reclaim the central position in a story that had already been shaped. He understood something very early and very clearly. You do not replace a legend by imitating him. If Morse had tried to play like Blackmore, he would have remained nothing more than a copy living under constant comparison. If he had tried to surpass Blackmore by being louder, fiercer, more flamboyant, he would have pulled the band back into the cycle of conflict that once tore it apart. Instead, he did the opposite. He accepted that the shadow would always exist, and rather than standing in its light, he stepped back to create his own light. Not loudly, not confrontationally, not competitively, just a different way of existing. For nearly 30 years, Steve Morse did not try to erase Blackmore's legacy. He left it there, as an inseparable part of Deep Purple. But he also proved that the band was not only memory. They could continue, more mature, more stable, and perhaps less tragic. This is not the story of a man who defeated a shadow. It is the story of a man who refused to compete with it. And sometimes, in rock, as in life, the best way to live beside a colossal shadow is not to stand in its light, but to quietly create your own. If you love stories behind the lights, where legends are not measured by noise but by how they endure over time, follow Icons and Legacies. Here, we don't just talk about immortal riffs. We talk about the people behind them, and about how they choose to live when the shadow of the past is still there.